Good afternoon, I'm Michael Malice. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. I'm very excited about today's show. But speaking of excited, you guys have to go to look at Rubin Report and what happened yesterday. He had on Blair White, who's transgendered, and Candace, I forget her last name, Owens or something, who goes by Red Pill Black on Twitter. And he had them have a debate. It was an hour and a half. And I was talking to my buddy Paul on Facebook this morning. And Paul pointed out there's two types of people. There are those of us who like train wrecks and those of us who find conflict uncomfortable and are averse to it. If you're from the first school, if you like 90 minutes of people shouting past each other, making no sense, watching Dave Rubin cringing the whole time, total minuscule drama being blown out of proportion, it is so hilarious. I tweeted this out. After 90 minutes of this, David said, you know, this could go on for another 20 hours. And he was saying that to wrap it up. And I tweeted, I could watch this till my legs got FDR'd. It was my favorite thing I've ever seen. You will not be disappointed. You will watch it the whole time like this. And what I got to point out, Candace, Blair's transgendered, kept referring to her intentionally as he. Now, listen, you don't have to be for or against this, but this is an aggressive move. So I thought that was really shitty of her. And she knows it's shitty. I mean, I have no problem being shitty. I'm the one who got blocked by, what's her name? Mia Farrow on Twitter because she was tweeting out something that the Pope said. And I tweeted out to her, I said, bitch, you gave birth to the Antichrist. And she blocked me. So I have no problem being aggressive and antagonistic, but you have to own it. So that's one thing. Another thing is, a year ago today, Donald Trump got elected president. Now, I will always give myself kudos. I can't pat myself on the back because this jacket's too tight. I called it quite early, and my point was twofold. One is it was a lot harder for him to be the nominee than to win the general. Just like for Obama, it was a lot harder to beat Hillary than it would be to beat McCain. And two, I pointed out that Hillary Clinton has a track record of being a walking calamity. And I pointed out in '94, it was because of her that the Republicans got Congress for the first time in 40 years. In 2008, she got beaten for the Democratic nomination by the black kid who didn't even bring a resume, which doesn't even happen at Burger King. In 2016, she almost lost the nomination to someone who wasn't even in her party, which should be technically impossible. So I knew this was going to happen. It was still crazy to watch it happen. I was watching Fox News on my computer, and I'll never forget Megyn Kelly. She goes, the New York Times is saying he's got a 90% shot. The New York Times. And I remember at a certain point, like they hadn't called Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or something like that, and he was like 7 electoral votes short. But Arizona and Alaska were still outstanding, which were not in contention whatsoever. So he had it, and I don't even remember this. I was at Tom Wood's 1000th episode, and someone printed out a fan printed out one of my tweets and laminated it for me to sign, which was, we have literally elected Hitler. And you know, now he's been president for a year. It's funny to me watch the hysteria people have because he hasn't done anything anywhere near as bad, in my opinion, as Bush, although he certainly has lowered the level of political discourse in one sense. But we're going to get into that shortly because that's a big myth that people used to be genteel and nice. Whereas if you look at even the founding fathers, the things that Adams was saying about Hamilton, were saying about Jefferson and all these other things, they were mind-boggling. You know, Romanism and all this other good stuff. Mama, where's my pot? I mean, this has been going on for a very long time. So go watch that video. Like, I promise you'll watch it. It's a lot better than the show, which is saying a lot because this show is excellent. Now, speaking of this show, a couple of weeks ago, I had an episode of my must-read books, a question I get all the time. And my guest today, David Petruzza, did I pronounce it right?
Yes.
Okay. Two or three of your books I mentioned as must-read. You're a historian. And it got back to you, which it didn't even cross my mind. And I'm super excited to have you here as a guest on the show. And let me fluff you up a little bit more. So you've written many, many books. The ones that I've read are histories of the 1920 presidential campaign, the 1960 presidential campaign, 1948, and am I missing one?
The 32.
And most recently, the 1932, which compares the rise of FDR and Hitler, the good fascist and the bad fascist. And what's amazing about your writing is when I write books for like celebrities, my point is I want this to be a book where if you don't care about these people, it's still a great book. It should read as a novel. So I don't think FDR is that interesting. I don't think Hitler's that interesting. I certainly don't think JFK, Lincoln, Nixon, and Kennedy are interesting, but you make it so fascinating and it reads like a novel. So how do you take these? What you do is you don't even talk about the politics and their issues as much. You write it in a very personality-driven way. So it's all about, you know, the Democrats who hate each other and the Republicans who hate each other. How do you get to figure out what these people are really like as people?
Well, I've been in politics.
Okay.
So I know that people are involved, and people may be on the same side, and these folks on the outside who think that if everyone in the Council of Foreign Relations all agrees with each other, or on the other side, it's all lockstep. But you get, you know, 5 people in the room, and they've got 5 different ambitions.
Right.
They may occasionally coincide and work together, but other times they're going to be for themselves. There's going to be some slight that they're going to be upset about. And so it's about personalities. It's also about process and how these things get done. You can also, if you're writing about history as opposed to like current events, you can step back more, and people aren't as invested in, you said something bad about the Democrat, you said something bad about the Republican. You can get beyond that, okay? And also, one of the things I find out and display in book after book is if you look at some straight line left-right continuum going back to the Garden of Eden, it ain't going to be there. Even in 1960, you know, JFK may be to the right of Nixon on certain things. And getting back into 1932 or 1920, it's very flip-flopped. Yesterday was the anniversary of women's suffrage in New York State. And women's suffrage was backed largely by the Republicans.
Oh, yeah.
And you'd say, well, the conservatives, the retrograde people, the traditionalists are the ones backing prohibition. In many cases, it's the progressives, particularly in the West, in the Republican Party.
Well, let's talk on that, because
Sure.
one of the things I talk about in my forthcoming book is that progressivism has very much been a mechanism of social control. We know what's best for you. And you see that in contemporary times, but it's actually the case 100 years ago. These are the same, it comes out of this whole social gospel. We're the anointed elite who know what's better than the sinners and the lower class.
The word expert shows up a lot. We will appoint the experts. We're going to take it out of the hands of these bad politicians who, in fact, are connected to the people. They may be crooks like in Tammany Hall or something, but they have some actual connection. And with TR, it's this, and Wilson, it's these circles of people that they know and that they respect, either because maybe they've gone to the same schools or they belong to the same clubs, and they're okay, and you're not.
Let's go through the books, because the one that I find my favorite of yours, so I own every book I've ever read. And I started digitizing some of them so they don't take up shelf space.
Okay.
I have your 1920 book somewhere in my house. I've turned up it spent 20 minutes looking for it. I still don't know where it is. This will drive me insane until I find it or I jump off a bridge, whichever one comes first. But this was, as your subtitle is, the year of 6 presidents. Yes. You have Coolidge, Harding, Hoover, Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, and FDR. And you also you don't include Taft for some reason.
He wasn't running.
Okay, sure. That's fair.
Yeah.
But he's
you had to be in competition in some way just to be alive, or a previous president, or you know, some guy who's going to get elected in 20 years after that. No, I wanted people who were actually in competition on one level or another at the top of the ticket.
But this is what people don't.
And that was the most, because I was rolling it around. I think originally I thought 1960 there were 3, and then I did that book afterwards, and then 1968 is 2. Which is Nixon and Reagan, okay? Hubert Humphrey isn't running, Johnson isn't running, or Hubert Humphrey doesn't get to be president. But in 1920, it was like all these guys. And also, I've somehow accumulated all this knowledge about the 20s and the teens and this era, which sometimes people care about but usually don't. And it was all rattling around in my brain. And the original title I proposed to the publisher was going to be the year of the six presidents, and they flipped it to 1920 and made the year of the six presidents the subtitle, and then we ended up with 3 books after that with the year as the title.
But this is what blew my mind. Both, am I remembering this correctly? I would have looked it up if I knew where the book was in my house. Both Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were considering running for president in 1920.
Yeah.
Talk about Wilson specifically, because the man not only was had obviously this massive stroke, but he was widely reviled. I mean, the 1918 elections were completely a repudiation of him.
Yeah, and worse in 1920 when he's not, by that time he's not running. But he has his stroke. He comes back from Paris, the Paris Peace Conference, has to get on the train, go around the country, work his work habits were not very strong as president because his health was not very strong. He suffered a stroke in, I think, 1907. He spent a lot of time. I once did an article about comparing the golf habits of Wilson and Obama. Okay, and it was on doctor's orders, but he comes back and he has to write all his own speeches. He has to project because there's no loudspeakers then. And he wears himself out. He has he comes off he's on the program or the podium at Pueblo, Colorado, and they have to lead him off the stage. He's not well. He gets on the train back and he's in his bathroom one night. He goes to the bathroom and falls over and he's bleeding on the bathroom floor with this massive stroke. They kind of prop him up and hide the state of his infirmity, but he is so delusional about his importance to the world.
That wasn't the stroke talking. Woodrow Wilson was probably the most arrogant, certainly up there of all the presidents. Yeah. Even the Democrat, JFK later talked about it, like this guy is not an FDR because he shot himself in the foot with the League of Nations stuff repeatedly. With
the League of Nations and with his call for a Republican Congress in 1918, which backfired like gangbusters. And that's why he's in so much trouble going into the conference, and he should learn from it, and he doesn't. He was, is pretty much of a fluke. He doesn't get. Of course, we've had. This is interesting. He wins the presidency twice without a majority, and Bill Clinton did the same thing. And occasionally, the public is trying to tell you something. You weren't all that popular. The first time he wins in 1912, he's got a smaller percentage of the vote than William Jennings Bryan got 4 years previously and getting creamed.
Right.
Okay? So, draw back. And sometimes it's not that you've won, it's the other guy lost. And act accordingly and act with some sort of judgment and reserve. And he will lose that. He does have some really big legislative accomplishments in it's almost like a New Deal under that. But he sends his Secretary of State, a fellow named Bainbridge Colby, who has no particularly qualifications to be Secretary of State. And in fact, Wilson was almost always his own Secretary of State. William Jennings Bryan, was his first Secretary of State. And then Robert Lansing, who, is rated very low. But he sends this Secretary of State to San Francisco to stampede the convention. And he meets with his fellow cabinet members there, and they go, "Are you crazy? This is the most irresponsible thing we've ever heard of." And the thing falls flat. But yes, technically, he wants the nomination and does something to gain it, even though it's crazy talk.
So when you're here, this is what I find fascinating. How do you find, so back then I think there was much more like waspy genteel in our discourse, at least publicly, right? Well, so how are you finding all these little nuggets where people, like for example, that quote from Coolidge in your book on 1932, when he talks about Hoover and he says, "That man has given me advice every single day for 6 years and all of it's been bad."
That's fairly famous.
Sure, but a lot of the other ones, you're finding it's just so savage and so bickering. It's fascinating. Like, where are these nuggets being discovered?
I work a lot from secondary sources.
Okay.
And if you keep looking and even physically going to the library and pulling books off the shelf that are somehow connected, or the movie The French Connection, the first one, not the bad one, the second one, the first one, where it's like, okay, they're looking for the cocaine or the heroin or whatever it is in the car, which has been smuggled in. And it's like, I've looked everywhere except in the rocker panels. What's the rocker panels, Irv? Rip it open. So it's like you go to the next book, you come across a name. Who is this guy? What's the connection? And you keep drilling and drilling and drilling. And, you know, most of the time you're not going to find anything, but you might find that one line which blows the reader off the page.
So when I was doing my North Korea book, I read 60 books as background. And anytime there was an interesting sentence or an interesting English syntax or something particularly unusual, like when, you know, they refer to America, if America stands up to us, we're going to slap her across the face. I'm like, ooh, that, you know,
yes.
That's so. But you're saying that even books that are 100 years old, they're having this kind of lowbrow discourse revealed to the public?
Yeah.
Wow.
Maybe not 100, but I mean, it might turn up in somebody else's research. But people were writing books. If you read Sonny Jim Watson's memoirs, he was a senator from Indiana, majority leader under Hoover. Couldn't stand Hoover. Talks about some of his boneheaded plays.
Let me just, from your book, 1932, this was hilarious. This is towards the end of the campaign. Hoover is giving a speech in front of a crowd. He gets 2 telegrams or telegraphs, and the second one tells him, vote for Roosevelt and make it unanimous.
Right.
To the president.
That's right.
How did that become known?
Oh, gee, I don't know how that became known, but a lot of the stories are, you know, some of this stuff, historians will just look at the big picture and the policy, and this was issued on such and such a date. And it's like, I want all that stuff in there. Okay. But also, could you imagine not only the chutzpah of this guy writing this, but what was the reaction of Hoover at this point? You know, it must have just, you know, broken his heart.
Well, it's like how FDR's election killed Coolidge.
Yes.
Basically.
Oh, just about.
Yeah, he died right before he was
just
inaugurated.
Before.
Yeah.
Now, in the 1920 book, in the epilogue, I talk about how Eleanor Roosevelt is sent to go. The president does not go to the ex-president's funeral. He must have been down south or something on some boat, on Vincent Astor's yacht or something. But he sends Eleanor and one of his sons to the funeral. And Eleanor, in the middle of the service, gets into a giggling fit. You know, these are the type of details I like to put in. You know, and sometimes I'll ask myself, dare I put this in? Is this like beneath serious history or something? And actually, it's not. It's very revealing about things. Or do you come out with a thesis that people don't want to hear, which is different, which is not politically correct or historically correct or the conventional wisdom?
Well, go ahead.
So one of my first books in jettisoning or transitioning from sports history was a biography of Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was the first commissioner of baseball, and he'd been a federal judge before that. And he's blamed for not allowing Jackie Robinson to get into the game. They put the onus on him for quite a while. And I went through it, and I could not find a lick of solid evidence. And I had to really shoot that theory down. And as I was doing that, it's like, am I going to get blowback on this? And in fact, a bunch of scholars have followed me and said, no, absolutely right. There was nothing to this story. It was just a tall tale being told by Bill Veeck, really.
Well, let's talk about blowback, because one of the things in your 1932 book is what we're told in the press and what history are often completely different things. And one of the things that has been the case historically is if you were powerful and gay, you could be gay, and people at the top would kind of be friends with you and look the other way, and it was kind of an open secret. Hollywood, in New York, in politics. You really went into it with Eleanor Roosevelt, and all of her kind of like lesbian friends.
Yeah.
And you didn't get close enough to saying she actually had a romantic relationship with these people, but you.
I don't know what goes on behind the door,
But
and no one's writing it down.
Right, that's the thing. But it's very clear that she and FDR, in many ways, had a Clintonian marriage.
Oh,
I mean, can you talk-
maybe worse.
Oh, let's talk about that, please.
Well, and for the same reason.
Right.
They have 6 children, and then in 1917 or so, FDR is Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He keeps packing Eleanor and the kids off to the camp in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick or wherever that place is, Campobello. And I'll be up there in a couple more weeks. And he never quite gets there. And she's like, He comes back from Europe during the war, gets sick. It's interesting that he seems more susceptible to illnesses before he gets polio. And that must build up some sort of resistance to other illnesses. And as he's getting off the boat, the letters from FDR and his girlfriend, she finds them. Eleanor finds them. The woman had been her social secretary, and this essentially destroys the marriage. They stay together. I think there's still some sort of feelings, but there's also this incredible wall, particularly on Eleanor's part. They stay together for the kids. They're still fairly young at that point, and they stay together for FDR's career.
But before you get into that, one of the things that blew my mind was you talking about Eleanor Roosevelt's childhood, and
it's gothic,
horrific.
Yeah, she's poor little rich girl.
Yeah.
Her mother was one of the most beautiful women in New York. Eleanor was not one of the most beautiful women in New York.
Right.
And I think that has to be hard on a kid. And the mother would sort of point that out to the girl. And that's got to be tough, too.
Of course.
But her father disappears from the scene because her father is Theodore Roosevelt's younger brother. He does not share Teddy's Victorian virtues. Right. He shares none of them. He's a drug addict, an alcoholic, a philanderer. TR describes him in the harshest words possible in private and not so private correspondence. He, in fact, dies by jumping out a mistress's window on, I think, West 102nd Street, is injured, doesn't die from those injuries immediately, but like 4 days later dies from some sort of a stroke or something. She identifies with the father, a great deal with the father, and her mother dies, and she's packed off to live with her grandparents, her maternal grandparents.
But you also, in your book, wrote when the mother died, Eleanor on the record said, "I didn't feel anything."
No.
Which is a terrifying admission.
Yes, yes. So it's a very strange childhood. And then she goes to live out with her maternal grandparents. The grandfather is some sort of very stern, a character from a bad movie, religious, high Episcopalian, all that. And her uncles are alcoholics again. There's some sort of incident where they're trying to break into her room at night, where a friend says, "Why do you have door locks on the inside of your room like that?" "To keep my uncles out." It's like, okay. Like I say, I'm not going to speculate more on that because I don't know, but okay.
This is when she's young.
This is when she's a kid.
Yeah.
Okay, then she goes off she is functionally illiterate until she's about 9 or 10 years old. They think she's stupid. Boy, that kid's stupid. It's like, no, the mother has neglected to teach her anything. And of course, a lot of the rich were homeschooled at that point. Franklin was, yes. And then if you get into like the 1928 and 1932 elections, Eleanor, particularly in 1932, is so remote from Franklin's election. She doesn't participate in a lot of things. She doesn't travel with him. She always has to rush off to teach at some private school on the Upper East Side. And she just doesn't seem to care. And in 1928, after Al Smith is defeated for the governorship and Franklin, or for the presidency, and Franklin wins for the governorship, she tells the New York Post, "What is it to me if we go live in the executive mansion for 4 years and Al Smith has lost?" Now, of course, it's the New York Post, so maybe it's not true or not, but a few weeks later, she writes to Eleanor Morgenthau the exact same words. It's like, I mean, how remote is she from his political ambitions? It's very, very remote.
And he didn't even go with her to the inaugural ball, you pointed out.
Right. Well, I mean, he couldn't dance. The funny thing, Franklin and Eleanor were great dancers when he could dance. Yeah. But she doesn't want to go to the inauguration with him on the train, the fancy train car that they have. She's going to go down with Lorena Hickok, her new special friend.
So let's talk about Hickok, because this is a character I'd never heard of before, but you were describing her as basically an out lesbian and this big end reporter.
Yeah, she was pretty.
But my understanding was people who didn't have the social space to be out back then.
Well, I don't know if she was out. I don't think she put it on her business card or anything.
It was kind of like a Rosie O'Donnell situation.
I think it was like you'd look at her and say, okay. She was not a lipstick lesbian, no.
Okay, understand.
All right.
Okay, and this is who Eleanor Roosevelt.
Kind of beefy.
Yeah, and this is who Eleanor Roosevelt's palling around with.
Yeah, well, before that, she had been palling around with a lesbian couple. I think she rented an apartment. She also kept. Eleanor and Franklin had a home on, I think, East 62nd Street, which was a gift from her mother-in-law, which was a problem because it was the mother-in-law had the house next door, and the doors opened up between them, like not anything perhaps any wife would like. And after the mother-in-law dies, that house goes on the market so fast and is sold so cheaply to Hunter College. Okay, just get rid of it. But she also has an apartment down in Greenwich Village, which is leased from a couple of lesbians, and of course she has like this top cottage up in Hyde Park. So there's this immense physical distance between her and her husband. Although one of the guides at Hyde Park was telling me that Eleanor and Franklin slept in the same bed until like 1921. Okay, it was until the polio. They were still sleeping together physically, and it was only because they had to have a servant come in and turn Franklin around overnight, because otherwise he'd get bed sores, and she just needed the sleep.
Wow. So let's talk about the Hitler stuff. Now,
okay.
I've never heard of this guy before. He seems to have a lot of good ideas.
Well,
what happened to him? No, I mean, a lot of this work is it hard when you're writing about someone who has been analyzed, like Nixon's another one, who's been analyzed to death from every single angle to try to find kind of what the truth is?
Well, I think in the first chapter of that 1932 thing, I say, don't expect me to fully explain this guy, because he is beyond explaining, and his rise. I think what's even more inexplicable than him, because there are all kinds of inexplicable people walking around Manhattan right now.
Sure.
Okay? And they've got all kinds of contradictions and weird ideas. And some of them are on the street corner with a cardboard sign, and others are in boardrooms.
And some buy Bitcoin.
Yeah, whatever. And some write books. And but they don't rise to be the head of their country. The fact that Germany is so dysfunctional at that point, I think, is even the greater mystery, that they would turn to this guy who, isn't even a citizen of their country, okay, until that election year, the middle of the year. He couldn't even run for anything until then. He had tried to overthrow the government. He should have been shot, right. Okay, or at least deported back to Austria. And that he ends the World War I in a psychiatric hospital, really. I mean, there's all kinds of problems there. And always at the last minute before he takes power, it looks like they're running out of steam, they're running out of money, they're running out of publicity. December 1932, the stormtroopers, the brown shirts, go back on the streets of Berlin, and instead of beating communists and Jews up, they're out there with tin cups begging for relief, and not for the poor, but to keep their operation afloat. It comes to that. And then all of a sudden somebody else needs to make a deal with him, and the money and the support flows in. And this has happened several times on his rise.
What's fascinating about the book 1932 and what people realize now is in that year, the word dictator did not have a negative connotation. It was very much something like, maybe this is something we haven't tried before in America and in Germany. Someone's gonna come in and fix this mess for us.
Mussolini is not completely off limits.
Yeah.
He's sort of respectable at this point. There's a film made by, I think, the Fox Studios.
Oh my, hold on a second. I'm literally hearing hammering. I'm going to get all Lawrence O'Donnell in here. Oh my God. I know how Lawrence O'Donnell feels. Could you break that? Okay, sorry, go ahead. You saw that clip, I'm sure.
I think I did, yes, okay, yes. He went.
Yeah, exactly.
It's New York. It's noisy.
Right,
Come on,
exactly.
people. A film is made. It's essentially an infomercial for Mussolini and his regime. It's narrated by Lowell Thomas, who was really a major media personality from the First World War until when I was a kid. I remember listening to him on the radio every night. He's the one who was with Lawrence of Arabia. And he's narrating this thing, and it makes a fortune in the middle of the Depression. So, and then there are films, or when FDR is inaugurated, people who had been very much opposed to him, Walter Lippmann, Al Smith, are saying, you should assume powers. You should assume all the powers to get this country back in shape. And, the Constitution, that's sort of outmoded.
Yeah, and we had these fascist NRA parades back then, where people were
Please define NRA.
the National Recovery Association, right?
Very good. Okay.
Where with the symbol was the Blue Eagle.
Yes, which is a basically fascist-looking thing.
Very fascist-looking if you pull it up. And the whole premise is it's going to set prices and wages and basically complete economic totalitarianism. And they would have parades up and down
Huge.
Fifth Avenue, people cheering, the government.
Any movie that's made, you look at movies made in that time period, it's got the NRA production seal on it. It's okay with the government. Or if a the famous stories of price controls. If you're on 7th Avenue or if you're on 10th Avenue, you have to charge the same amount to dry clean a shirt as on 5th Avenue. And the guy says, I got to make it cheaper because no one's going to come out here. And they go, no, you don't. And we're going to shut you down. Or the Schechter brothers chicken case out in Brooklyn, where you couldn't go pick out your own chicken. I want to buy that chicken. No, you can't. The government says you have to take a random chicken. Hello, it's not the government's business.
There's the symbol right there. Yeah,
yes.
The Blue Eagle. And a lot of that was struck down. But then, of course, when FDR got more and more people in the Supreme Court, they started looking the other way.
Right. Well, the threat was there, and the court will follow the election returns too. So after 1936, even though there's resistance to the court packing scheme, guys are going to retire. It's like, okay, we're out of here. Sort of like everyone seems to be retiring from the House of Representatives in the last 6 weeks.
Does it drive you crazy as a historian when so many progressives regard history as this unilateral, one-directional wave? It goes from Wilson, then we kind of went the wrong way in the 20s, then back to FDR, and it's just been culminating ever since. That it's this kind of Marxist idea that history is irresistible and is just, don't get in its way because this is the way we're all going.
Well, the point which occurs to me as I write each book is like I say, don't look for that left-right continuum. And also, things are going to... Before Trump was sworn in, I was trying to meet someone for lunch, and it didn't work out. And then she ended up doing an interview at Trump Tower and was in there and was sort of on radio silence. And so I was like waiting outside, hoping she'd come out. And there was this very nice girl from Brooklyn who was outside protesting Trump. And it was like, She was on the verge of a breakdown. Okay, she didn't seem like a normally crazy person, but the politics of it had been like this was the worst thing in the world. And I says, you know, if your side, if you want to help your side, you have to maintain greater composure to this. And let me tell you, give you this example, that example, that example. The world changes very quickly politically. Your side may come back in 4 years like gangbusters. Who predicted Trump? You know, at this moment in time, it's be patient. It's as I used to say in baseball, life is a 162 game season.
Yeah, so it's just also fascinating when I have a lot of friends who are in the whole New Right movement. It's my next book is about that, and they say that we've never had attacks on free speech like this before. It's like Woodrow Wilson put the socialist candidate in jail.
Yes, jail is.
And it was Warren Harding who pardoned him, but it's like. No one was putting Jill Stein in jail. No one is putting Obama in jail or Gary Johnson or any of these other people.
There's a conference, I think, today, or was it yesterday, at Columbia University, Trump and the march toward authoritarianism. Well, hello, if there was real authoritarianism going on under Trump, I don't think the Democrats would have won every single election in the world yesterday. Right. That's not what happens in authoritarian systems.
You don't get to complain on Twitter.
Right. It's like,
so you're Polish. You said I'm from Soviet Union. So to me, when I hear Americans talk about how bad it is, I'm like, you don't know how far you have to go before things get really scary, or even close to scary. I mean, many of my friends are pro-choice. I'm like, you've got a long way to go before this is a pro-life situation. In this
if they repeal Roe versus Wade, abortion is going to stay on the books in New York,
yes,
California, and X number of other states because the law is just going to fall back to what it was in the 1960s, where it was legal in the big population areas.
And it's funny, like not funny, like so many friends, like they're going to round up gay and transgender people and put them in concentration camps, like FDR, and it's like he hasn't been able to get anything through.
No.
What are you talking about?
Right.
And it's wild to me. The point I always make is if you are on the left and you hate Trump, you really want him in office because Mike Pence is far worse from your perspective than Trump. He's far more effective at governing, far more respectable in the press, and far more of an ideologue.
Well, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, yes, you do want him because you want to campaign against him.
Yeah.
You want to campaign against him, and there's this great rush of goodwill which flows to any new president. So as divided as we are, the people in what remains of the middle may flip over and say, Mike Pence, good, just out of relief.
Right.
That Trump and all the vibrations will end for a while.
Let's talk about...
And like when Harry Truman, 87% approval rating when he takes over from Franklin Roosevelt. And Johnson, Johnson, of course, rides that for quite a while.
Let's talk about 1960, because who do you think is a more vile human being, Nixon or LBJ?
I think LBJ.
Okay, why is that? Even Robert Caro is the obviously very famous LBJ historian. I don't find LBJ interesting at all, but by all accounts, he is a horrible human being.
He's a weird guy.
Yeah.
He's a weird guy, but if I can just digress to a point, Roger Stone has a book out that LBJ killed Kennedy, and some any number of people believe any number of alternate theories on this. As vile and calculating as LBJ was, he loved John Connally. John Connally, the governor of Texas, was his protege. If he was going to kill JFK, he would have called John Connally over and said, John, I think you're a state official, and Kennedy is a federal official. You shouldn't be in the same car.
Some excuse.
Yarborough, Ralph Yarborough, that son of a bitch, he's a federal official. He should be in the same car, okay? and I wish Bobby was in that car. Okay, but he would not have put his pal at risk, and in fact, Connolly is shot with the so-called magic bullet.
But what's interesting is no one would put it past him on a moral level.
I don't think so. There isn't much moral level on him. No, I mean he does. I think he has certain beliefs. He's a progressive. He's a New Deal guy. But again, in terms of morality, after he loses for the Senate in 1942, and that election is stolen from him, I think that's a pretty good theory. He determines, I can't get elected in Texas as some New Deal liberal. You know, it's like I've got to trim my sails. And by 1948, he's running against every civil rights measure, and he's running against the unions, and he barely squeaks by then. And then in the 50s, he's walking this very fine line between the Southerners in the Senate and the Northern liberals. And after 1958, there are a lot more Northern liberals, and he wants to be president in 60, so you know, what's he going to do? And he doesn't do much of anything that year. And then he trots out maybe what are his core beliefs or what he thinks will be most effective because you can't shoot Santa Claus.
Right.
Okay? So the more money and favors you can give to people, the more they will love you. And it certainly worked in 64, but after that, everything fell apart with the riots and the crime, and particularly with Vietnam.
Well, that's what else is fascinating, what you were talking about earlier with that girl outside Trump Tower. LBJ's elected in 64 in like the biggest landslide, I think, before or since. I mean, and then 4 years later, he can't even get the nomination.
2 years later, the Republicans make these massive gains in the Congress. The Republicans are back in 2 years. Yeah. And there's prosperity, which is, will prosperity keep Trump afloat with all the other, because he just Bigfoots every other issue.
Yes.
If there's prosperity, then he will boast about it and turn it on him, and actually he thinks in a positive way, but in a negative way, because people just want to say, shut up.
Let's talk a little. So let's talk a bit about things that become perceived as true, which aren't actually true. For example, when Nixon passed that 64 Civil Rights Act, he was Johnson, excuse me. He was quoted as saying, "I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for a generation." Yeah. There's no actual source for this quote.
Really?
Yeah. I tried to track it down. Some airline pilot claimed he heard Johnson say it. And the other one, this is more up your alley, is this was a joke that's become part of history, where the joke was, I bet I can get Calvin Coolidge. The woman sitting next to Calvin Coolidge at dinner, she turns to him and says, I made a bet with my friend, I could get you to say 3 words, and he said, you lose.
Oh, I think that actually did happen. The chicken and rooster story doesn't seem to be true, though.
Tell me that one. I don't know. I don't remember that one.
He and his wife Grace, Coolidge and his wife Grace, are at some big, maybe the state fair in Massachusetts, and they're going through the poultry exhibit, and there's like all these chickens everywhere, and they're talking, or maybe it's not chickens, maybe it's a cow and a bull. And they point out this bull and how it's the champion inseminator or whatever, and how it does all these cows, it's done all these cows. And Grace says to the fellow giving the tour, you might want to tell that story to Mr. Coolidge. And he does, and Coolidge says, does he do it with the same cow every night? And the guy says no. And he says, you might wish to tell that story to Mrs. Coolidge.
Well, let's talk about Calvin Coolidge, because he's someone, you've written how many books about him too?
3, actually. 3 edited, really.
He is someone who, in your opinion, probably gets a bad rap, historically speaking.
Oh, sure. The New Deal historians really trashed that whole decade of the 20s.
Have you read this book called They Also Ran?
Yes, I was just reading it about Alton B. Parker the other night.
1904.
Yes.
So he was the first time the Democrat was more conservative than the Republican.
Maybe not. The Democrats, particularly in New York State through the 19th century, were all pretty conservative. And then the question, in the 19th century, how you define conservatism is really mystifying.
But he was the difference between him and Teddy Roosevelt was probably
I
the
think
biggest.
he's more conservative.
Yeah, by far.
Certainly by personality.
He was some random judge that they just picked out of nowhere.
They didn't have a lot of choices.
Right. So in this book, it's fascinating because the author, Irving Stone, I believe is his name.
Yes, who was a very famous novelist,
Yeah,
you know.
was trying every year he picked the two candidates, and the reason I heard about this book is Bob Dole, bless his heart, said there should be a official government position for whoever loses the presidency. And it's like, why would, if you're a Republican, why are you in favor of rewarding losers? That's beside the point. The point of the book is he goes through every campaign. He says, you know, who he thinks is the better candidate.
It's right on the cover.
Yeah. And sometimes it's, you know, the Democrats, not the Republican. But consistently, the one he says is the better candidate is the one who's in favor of bigger government. Literally every single time.
Oh, sure.
And Warren Harding on the cover, he has a magnifying glass because it's on like a scale of 1 to 10 because he's so little and so pathetic. And
Coolidge is small, too.
Yeah, Coolidge is small. But at the same time, I don't think these types realize that this is a governing choice.
Yeah.
To not be, you know, involved in the economy and not be this kind of like, you know, economic dictator.
When he the losers who get very close to the winners are like when it's a Wendell Willkie in 1940.
Right.
When it's the most liberal loser you can get.
Or Hoover does well for him also.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Hoover and Smith are about evenly matched.
Yeah.
Yes.
So is it frustrating to you? Is this something that historians are increasingly coming to appreciate? Or are they so much in love with FDR that it's just forget about it?
I'm afraid that it's still a very, well, as academia is dominated by people on the left, all the historians tend to be the same way. So it's a very small number of conservative historians. Some of them write books which are clearly meant, you know, hit you over the head and say this is a conservative book.
Right.
And I don't do that.
No.
A lot of people have commented that, you know, you can't tell what my politics are from this book, which I think is the way I want it.
Well, you can tell in this sense because from your perspective, every politician is a jackass. And I think that would put you on the right side of the aisle if that's your impression.
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot more hero worship on the left.
Yeah.
Really, and fawning, right. Which is something which has always rubbed me the wrong way. It's like we may admire a Reagan or a Coolidge, but it's like, you know, we don't bow down before them. You know, you read some of these bios, and it's like every advisor is Ted Sorensen is brilliant, and the next guy is brilliant, and everyone on their side is brilliant, and it's like, no, some of them are just there. You know?
Well, like Steve Bannon recently said that, you know, Hillary Clinton's not that bright.
I don't think so.
The proof is in the pudding. She blew the easiest win.
Absolutely.
So it was, and actually, it's just very funny to me because I agree. Like I got defriended on Facebook because I just made a joke that I don't remember what the setup was.
She's the only person who could have lost to Trump.
Yeah,
I believe that.
Oh yeah. Well, besides Jeb.
Well, the only Democrat.
Right. I posted on Facebook as a joke. I don't remember what the setup was. I wrote, Ronald Reagan must be spinning in his sarcophagus. And someone unfriended me. I'm like, relax. Ronald Reagan had a good sense of humor. Like, he's not hearing this right now. It's just very weird, that sense of idolatry, which I think goes hand in hand with this Wilson and FDR dictatorship that the president here to save us from ourselves. Which is a
sort of worship government. Then you have to, you know, bless yourself to the high priest or something, you know?
I mean, do you think this started with what? Teddy Roosevelt was the first one?
He's really the first to make it into this. Things change, and his attitude as to what government can do. I just came across reading about Alton B. Parker and all that. There's a question of veterans. The veterans want a pension, or they want an expansion, and it can't get through Congress. What does he do? Executive order, you know, all the national parks, executive order. Or if it's not specifically, you know, he turns the Constitution on its head. Constitution says, unless we give you these powers, you can't do this.
It's explicitly the 10th Amendment.
And his is, unless you tell me I can't, I'm doing it.
Yeah.
I'm doing it if it's politically expedient. And then his whole attitude where turning every political issue into something moralistic. If you disagree with me, even though you've been friends with me for, you know, 20 years. All of a sudden, you're a liar, you're corrupt, you're bought, and everything gets electrified in terms of politics and polarized. And you know, we're suffering from that right now.
Is it so? Let's talk a little bit about 1948, because I remember when Bush, the first President Bush, was running for re-election, and he was talking how much he loved Harry Truman, how great Harry Truman was.
When you're behind, you love Truman.
Yeah, right, but that's fair.
He's a role model.
But he, until I think W, was the most unpopular president in modern times. He hit like 20-something% approval.
23, I think, in the middle of the Korean War.
Yeah.
The Democrats kind of semi-hide him in 1960 because he's still not popular. It's like, and we're the party of Wilson and Roosevelt and Truman, because he still hasn't. It's the power of media. He has that. There's that plain speaking book which comes out, which really raises him because it tells all his side of the story, which is the first book which has done that for a while, except for his memoirs. And that one-man play, Give 'Em Hell, Harry, which was very popular in the 60s. The media will turn people's ideas historically, to wit, Oliver Stone's JFK.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of people who think, oh, yeah, that's exactly what happened in the trial in New Orleans. It's like, nah. Do not watch movies for history, ever.
But it's also fascinating when people talk about Trump. Truman told a reporter he was going to beat the crap out of him in writing.
Yeah.
You know, so this is not new.
Well, he was varying back and forth. You know, he'd be blustering 1 minute, and then probably, I think, more privately, it would be like, well, his actions election night, where he escapes from the press, goes hiding in this resort hotel in Excelsior Springs, Missouri, goes to bed at 9 o'clock at night.
Well, so did Dewey went to bed early as well.
Yeah, but he was like, he wasn't hiding from the press. It was like, you know, this is not what a winner does. A winner makes himself available. In 1960, in the West Virginia primary, JFK leaves the state. He's taking in a movie in Georgetown with Ben Bradley, okay? And it's like, and then Bobby says, you won. And then he has to get back, and Truman has to get back. If you know, I have no idea where Nicole Metaliotakis was last night. I suspect it was not at the center of the media.
Right.
She probably wanted to hide. So, yeah, I think he is not sure. Even Theodore Roosevelt, you know, a lot of these guys are really insecure when you get down to it. Roosevelt.
Well, if you're attacked every day in the press, it's going to get to your head no matter who you are.
Theodore thinks he's not going to win in 1904 in many cases. I don't know. He writes to his kid, you know, we had 3 years in the White House. It was great, you know. It's like, you know, you get the biggest landslide in history up to that point, and you think you might lose.
Right. And now you're on Mount Rushmore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which will probably be dynamited the way things are going now. Who they going to have? I mean, nobody's safe. I mean, they attacked the statue of Lincoln in Illinois. They smeared the TR statue, the equestrian statue, in front of the Natural History Museum, and they were talking about how it was inappropriate even before that. The Roosevelt family funded that place.
Oh, yeah. It's a lot of the skins in the museum are animals that Teddy killed himself.
But the money came in even before him. You know, let alone Jefferson and Washington up there now.
I think what that's a symbol of, and this is a long side conversation, is the fact that they're not being able to win the battle in the present, so they have to go back in the past where there's a consensus that these people were bad, or most of them. That's what I think is happening.
I don't know what, but I mean, if you destroy all the statues in the streets and the park, then the people have even less sense of history than they do now. There's nothing for them to even think about or debate. All you're going to be, what's your streetscape going to be? Just food trucks? Okay, can we have some sense of the past?
That was the promise. Remember, a food truck, and was that Hillary who promised one, a food truck in every corner?
Why not? It's so Brooklyn-esque, if I may say.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Okay.
But I think that the internet is exposing a lot of this for what it is. And what else is hilarious is back in the day, I guess before the New Deal, or maybe you could correct me, the media was partisan. This is a Republican paper, it's a Democrat paper. Now there's the pretense that the media is objective. And in real time,
not at all.
There's a pretense.
Right.
A complete pretense.
Yeah.
And you have Trump after Charlottesville saying, what's next? Washington and Jefferson? And everyone's like, oh, he's a lunatic.
Right.
And then what, a week later?
Yes.
And when you have these things side by side on social media, and I talk about this all the time.
If people will go to that, the specific thing on the social media, but I had something happen this morning. I was talking to a room clerk in the hotel, and said I'd been to a talk the night before, a master class, music. And what struck me, aside from how interesting the whole process was that the person's voice, after a while, I realized the instructor spoke very much like Newt Gingrich. His speech patterns, the timbre of his voice, and the woman didn't know who Newt Gingrich was. The level of ignorance about public policy, let alone history.
You think this is new? I think that's the norm.
It's like, this is shocking to me.
Well, that's because you're a historian.
I guess so.
I mean, you can't. I can talk to you about jeans, and you're not going to know what I'm talking about with my 30 pairs of denim.
Okay,
and that's fine. But I think I think the people who are educated. I mean, and I don't mean educated in a college sense, but the people who understand what's going on.
Yeah.
They have a venue now to pull the curtain back and be like, you are being lied to, and here's the side-by-side screen caps of CNN saying Trump's crazy. I did this myself. It went viral. Trump's crazy for saying it's Washington and Jefferson, and the next week, we got to take down Washington and Jefferson. And so, you don't need a big conversation. You just need one tweet and be like, yeah, that's all. The thing with the fish this week. When he was in Japan, he dumped in all the fish food. First of all, my first job was for an aquarium magazine. There's no benefit to feeding a pond spoonful by spoonful as opposed to a box. Koi are bottom feeders. It wouldn't be a problem. And then it showed that it wasn't even what they said, that they both threw in the whole box. And when you have these things side by side, like I was saying, just with the Soviet Union, when you look at the press as having an agenda.
It's constant nitpicking.
Yes. I mean, it's unprecedented, but it's also, I just tweeted this out yesterday. Here were 4 actual stories. Trump eats steak wrong. Trump eats KFC. Trump eats McDonald's. Trump called a kid not fat. And now Trump feeds fish wrong. And Trump gets 2 scoops of ice cream. These were actual news stories. So it's a lot less effective, in my opinion, the propaganda, than it was, let's say, during the 1930s. Where to speak against Roosevelt was unconscionable.
Well, you couldn't photograph him with his crutches or anything.
We have time for one last question, or two. Can you answer for the audience, did they know FDR was in a wheelchair in the 30s?
A lot of people did not.
Okay.
And when he reviews the inauguration, he's at a stool, okay? So you think he's standing, and or the car has a brace on it. They take him up to a ramp. So even people who are there with him at the time may not be able to fully understand what's going on. He never references it.
But they know he has polio.
They know he has polio.
And they know he's not an effective walker, at least.
Right. They know he has to have help. And he'll say, I need to walk with canes. Well, okay. Which is a far different thing than his actual circumstances. Hey, Mitch McConnell had polio.
Did you see what happened with him?
Yes.
And they were making fun of him for getting help from Trump walking up the stairs.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a very inspiring story that he overcame that.
Oh, yeah.
He was at Warm Springs for 2 years as a kid.
Yeah, so I mean, all sorts of stories like this. So the other question about what's fascinating about FDR, you didn't mention this in the book because this takes much later. Not only did he strike Hoover's name from the dam, after successfully getting Hoover to be blamed for the Depression, he denied him Secret Service protection.
No, they never met, and they had been friends. They had been friends, and there had been talk of a Hoover-Roosevelt ticket in 1920, and that came from Roosevelt.
Yeah.
They had been so close, but he just walks away from what my mind boggles is that Truman, who could be very partisan and blame the Republicans of the 20s for his business losses, why he turns to Hoover. He turns to him for relief of the people starving in Europe and also for government reorganization. The first Hoover Commission is under Truman. And for him to reach across the aisle like that is very interesting. People are complex.
Even despite Hoover's background in that exact field, at the same time, he was a very convenient whipping boy because you could be like, you vote Republican, you're getting Hoover again.
Right.
And it's funny because, and this is something all my libertarian friends talk about constantly, Hoover was not some conservative.
Not at
he
all.
was very much a Mitt Romney technocrat, kind of like, we got to get the government involved. And
He worshipped Wilson.
Yeah, and fixing
And he
all the
voted for
problems.
TR in 1912.
Yeah. So he's not this kind of Calvin Coolidge figure whatsoever. He's very much this kind of, in my opinion, worst of all worlds, which is a liberal Republican who has the faults of the left and none of the benefits of the right.
And is greatly just uninspiring in a crisis.
Yeah.
That's a big part of it, I think, where he talks about closing the banks as a moratorium, big word. Roosevelt does the same thing after denying Hoover the right to do it and calls it a bank holiday.
Right.
Happy talk.
Yeah, moratorium's death,
Yeah,
holidays happy.
right.
Last question, because then I'm out of time. Who did you lose the most respect for as a human being the more you did research on them? And don't say Hitler.
Boy, that's an interesting question. I think we probably stayed in the same groove here. I don't know. The odd thing was in all four of those books, Eleanor Roosevelt shows up in all of them. And in 60 and 48 and 20, she comes across okay. But in 32, she comes across as seriously weird.
Okay, I think that's a fair. Well,
Okay.
she also had her hand behind the UN Declaration of Human Rights,
Yes.
which is actually being used as a cudgel somewhat effectively with North Korea. So I have to give her credit for that a little bit. Thank you, David, so much.
Thank you.
We're out of time. Pick up all his books, including 1932, which just came out. I'm Michael Malice. I'll see you next week with Laura Loomer. You're welcome.
What's the